Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. Hello, Engagers. So today we have Dustin. And before we introduce Dustin, are you prepared to engage?
I am ready.
Let's do this. Let's rock. So he is with his beautiful and wonderful wife, Grace, living currently in Taiwan. And he teaches English at a university in Taipei and works in the field of education in other various capacities, including consulting and research. He's always looking for ways to create a more engaging classroom, to develop a strong classroom culture, to strengthen learning. And this is how Board Gaming with Education was founded, because Dustin is also a podcaster, a fellow podcaster. He contributes to the podcast as the host. He also does the website design, editing, and some marketing, of course. You can find Dustin playing board games with friends, teaching at his university, running around Taipei, training for races, jamming to music, or at any of the Board Gaming with Education events. So that sounds fantastic, Dustin. Is there anything that we missed from that intro?
No, that sounds good. Thank you for having me on. It'll be great to talk about games and education.
Absolutely. It's one of our favorite and main topics here at Professor Game. So Dustin, you're in Taiwan, you're at the university, you're consulting, you're doing many different things. Can you tell us, what does a regular day or maybe even week look like? What does it feel like to be Dustin right now in Taiwan?
So I would say my favorite weeks would be, or days, are the days when I'm on vacation from teaching. I love teaching, so it just gets really busy sometimes. So it really depends on whether I have any tasks or responsibilities at my university or other projects they've asked me to work on, or if I have a little break from that. So either I'm really focused on teaching and my course design and planning lessons and all of that, or I'm working on the Board Gaming with Education podcast and doing a little bit of research in game-based learning.
That sounds very exciting and very related to what we'll be talking about today. So Dustin, as you know, because you've been doing this for a while as well, and you've interviewed other people who have been doing gamification and so on, gamification is not always something that works the first time or the second time or maybe even the third time. There's mistakes, there's failures, and those are things that we learn from. So would you tell us a story about what you would call your favorite fail or first attempt in learning, and what you learned from that, how you overcame that failure, what you did afterwards? Can you bring us to the ground level? We want to be there with you.
Right. So I would say one failure that kind of came from gamification was about a year ago when I first used it in my university level classes. And I created a system called a knowledge point system. And they earn KP by coming to class, completing different assignments on Google Classroom. And they also received KP for winning different games we played in class, because I also ran a flipped classroom. So a lot of their lecture was done online, and they did a lot of writing in class. I was teaching a writing course at the time. So we had this opportunity to kind of play games in class to get to know my students a little bit. Since I don't really interact with them as a group in the class, I would meet with them one-on-one. But what I found is I jumped in too fast, and I had too much going on that it created a lot of work for me. I think also I did try to do games too much that semester, because usually what I get when I do a pre-semester, mid-semester, and post-semester survey to my students asking how the course is going, what do they expect, is there anything I should change? Games are usually one of the top things that they want to do in class. And so I usually cater towards, my students' needs, and I try to develop games in class. And I think I did it a little bit too much that semester, because the post-semester survey, I got a few responses. I mean, generally they're pretty good, but normally I don't get responses that say we played too many games in class. So from that, I think a couple things stemmed from that experience. Is one, I don't think that the gamification system or games should be as much of a focus as it had been that semester. And also, I was able to create a more streamlined process for gamifying the classroom.
That's fantastic, and it's very, very related as well to the other thing that we would like to ask. But before I go to the next question, I would like to sum it up in the learnings and some of the things that you experienced. And sometimes people, when they're thinking of gamifying, they're kind of afraid that it'll be too much work. And actually, you've you made real some of the fears that it became a bit too much. Is there any like quick advice you could give to people who are thinking about doing this, maybe are afraid that it'll be too much work? How can they overcome that fear? How's a way around maybe gamifying too much or generating maybe too much work for yourself in the first time?
I would definitely say start small. That's number one, start small. And number two, maybe reach out to others who have done it before, because you can use some of their ideas, some of their resources in your classroom and adapt them. You don't need to take the whole thing, but use aspects of it. But I think starting small is probably the key there.
Yeah, starting small. I think I don't know if you've heard that as well. People start doing it, they get really excited because, I don't know, people who are excited about games and gamification see this and see the potential it has, and we get very, very excited about the things that we could do and sometimes take up too much. So that would be a fantastic advice, like starting small and seeing how it works. I don't know, like playtesting and that kind of thing, I think would be something that works very well. And in the sense of things that do work well and have worked well for you, can you tell us of an experience, Dustin, of something that you faced a big challenge in your classroom, in your gamification consulting? You faced a big challenge and said, look, this is something that I'm going to solve using board gaming, games, gamification, and how it happened, how it worked. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, so I think the first time I used games was the first time I was teaching. I graduated university back home in Nebraska, and I went abroad to Korea to teach. And my position there, I worked at an after-school program. They call it a hagwon in Korean. It's like a cram school. They study a different subject. They might have an English after-school program, science, math, a lot of different topics and activities that you can do. So I was teaching there for that year, and I had one class that was very, very challenging to manage their behavior. In class, there were 9 boys out of 11, and a lot of times they would get out of their seat, they would run around, they would speak Korean when we were supposed to only use English in the classroom. And these were 12, 13-year-old boys, so it was a bit challenging for me to manage their behavior. And in the school, they use a reward system where you get a star if you answer a question correct. You get a star if you're doing something positive to reinforce that behavior. You get a red star if you're speaking Korean or if you're doing something you shouldn't be doing. And that system just was not working. I was also given suggestions by teachers to do it as a classroom. So if anyone in class does something, maybe give the rest of the class a red star. And that was not working either. So Avengers was really popular at the time. This was the first Avengers movie, so we're getting into the final version here. And I used Avengers superheroes in class, and I split students up into groups, and each group chose a superhero. And at the end of the board, we had Loki. And at the time, Loki was a definite bad guy. He's not maybe bad, maybe good. He was definitely bad at that time. So each group had a superhero, and I also chose a superhero. So it was a race to get to the end of the board to fight Loki. And if they did something they were supposed to be doing in class or they answered a question correct, their superhero would move. If they did something they weren't supposed to do or they spoke Korean, my superhero would move.
So you basically themed up the star system and gave them an objective to reach, right?
Right. So I think it worked really well because there was some competitive nature among groups, but it really tapped into that Korean culture of community and the community classroom of learning and education there.
So basically, again, you were tapping into what their motivations were, what they were actually looking towards. I mean, something that was actually exciting them for sure. And I think that's a strong way of actually framing something that was already existing, because if you think about it and you take away all the feelings and the things that us humans do, you actually had exactly the same, red star, yellow star, system, but you framed it around a whole story, something that was exciting and engaging for them, and that was something that I'm guessing that made all the difference for your class. Is that right?
Right. I think that's what really, I mean, at the time I would try to find ways to relate to my students. And I think that is what helped to snowball this effect of trying to bring games into the classroom more often or finding different ways to engage my students.
Absolutely, and I'm convinced that that's something that start of that effort is something that has been snowballing not only into that class, which was certainly, if you're now in Taiwan, you're not teaching in that Korean class anymore, but that has been snowballing into the rest of your practice as a teacher and as a professor of English, and now doing all these things in gamification. And you've been describing a couple of things that you've done that are related to gamification and to games and to using games in class. But we would like to know, for example, if you're helping somebody, let's say you're helping somebody or you're facing a new class, do you have some sort of a process, a series of steps, I don't know, a framework that you use when you're creating gamification or board games for your class? How do you come about it?
Right. So I think there's two different lines of thought that go through my head when I'm designing a lesson to use a game. In board games, there's the line of thinking that either the theme comes first when you're designing a game or the mechanics come first. And I think this kind of applies to also lesson planning for using a game in the classroom. And what I think about is either the learning objective and if the game has that learning objective as a part of it, or if I can build a game to meet that learning objective. So a couple examples of maybe more popular board games would be Werewolf. So the learning objective or the language objective would be to be able to form an opinion and maybe ask clarification. So in the game Werewolf, you're asking or you're stating, I think Dustin is a werewolf because he's not talking. Now, that's a language objective built into the game. You might need to ask for clarification as well. You said Dustin's a werewolf. Why do you think that? So this would be an example. Another example would be code names. So this is more vocabulary based. So you use the vocabulary you're learning in class. And in code names, you have to match the words and help your team try to match the words. So if you're not familiar with code names, there's two teams. One team gives a clue, and the other team has to find the words on an 8x8 grid. It's essentially the game. So that helps with vocabulary knowledge. And then the other way would be adding the learning objective or the language objective into the game. So a very basic example would be Uno. And if we play Uno, you really can play the whole game and only say one word. That's Uno when you have your last card. That's not going to be very helpful for language learning. But what you can do is you can apply something like you need to say a word with an adjective in the present continuous tense. And that way they're learning whatever grammar objective you're teaching. Another example of a game is this Noah's Ark, Don't Rock the Boat. This is a game I use with younger students, and essentially they're choosing a card and putting an animal on the boat, and it kind of topples, so you have to be careful to balance it onto the boat. So with this, I had printed out cards of the animals, I printed out adjectives, I printed out articles with the, and different adjectives, so they had to form a sentence before they could put the animal onto the boat. So those are just a couple different ways that I might start with either the language objective and then the game, or start with the game and then the language objective.
And when you're exploring each of these ways, or maybe take one of them, how do you decide? Like, how do you explore what games you could be using? What would be your references? Where do you go to?
So I think that what has been really helpful is playing a lot of games. When I play a game, I'm really just, the first thing I think about now is how can I use this to help me in education or help other students learn, or can it be applied to some sort of learning setting? If not, then I start to enjoy the game a little bit more. I'm not thinking, my teaching brain kind of turns off. So that's one way. Or if I have a language objective and I'm thinking, how can I engage my students? And I just can't think of a game. I start to think about, well, how can I turn this learning objective into a game? So I have designed a couple games based on that. One game I did a negotiation game where each group formed a company. They started off with a limited number of resources like money, workers, and products, and they had to go meet with other companies to do a trade. and each company had a different secret objective they needed to complete. And a lot of times they had to sacrifice money to get the products, but in the long run, they would earn more money. So it's kind of a level of negotiation with the other companies.
That sounds very exciting. It's very good. Just a quick break before we continue with this episode. If you've been enjoying this podcast, I would really appreciate if you share it with your friends and family and on social media. On Twitter and Instagram, it's at RobAlvarezB and the hashtag ProfessorGame, all one word. And in Facebook, you can find the Professor Game page. Thanks in advance for your engagement. So Dustin, we are now going to move into this sort of quick answers of the podcast. The idea is to pull from your experience, what you've been learning, what you've been doing, what you like, what you dislike, what you think. So the first one is, if there's something that you would say that could benefit almost any board gaming in education or any gamification project for education, or sort of a best practice, something that you say that, well, if you think of this, or if you use this strategy, or if you do these things, it will probably make your project at least a little bit better or a lot better.
Right. So I think I love listening to your show, and I've been going back to some of the teachers that you've had on your show, and maybe you can help speak to this as well based on some other guests you've had on in education. I think there's a misconception when it comes to gamification in education, and a lot of times I think there's two strong misconceptions. One, this is gaming the classroom. It's not how learning should happen. We should not learn through games. And another one is that anyone that's kind of aware of what gamification is, they see it as just a behavioral management tool and to reinforce positive behavior. And I think it does, and I think that's super helpful in the classroom. But I think one thing that a lot of teachers might miss out on and not consider when they think about gamification is adding elements to develop classroom culture. I know because I've reached out to made some posts on Reddit and Facebook to ask, what do people think about using a gamification kit in your classroom? And a lot of them, that's what they heard echo a lot was, well, it works for reinforcing positive behavior, but we know that extrinsic rewards don't always motivate students, or they lose their motivation through that. But what I've tried to develop in my gamification kit is adding an element of classroom culture in various ways. One example is each week they go on an RPG adventure. So this helps with forming a student-teacher relationship through a little bit of interaction in the game. They can also communicate with their classmates and see how they can solve this problem together as a group. Also, having students work in groups like a guild, earning XP, I think is a good way to help with collaboration as well. So I think that is something that definitely needs to be considered, is how to add elements of class culture. Because a lot of times as teachers too, we get so caught up on our learning objectives and our course objective, and we kind of let that emotional learning, that student-teacher relationship fall by the wayside a little bit.
Yeah, and that could happen as well. And one thing that I would definitely take from what you're saying is the fact that some people just see gamification as a sort of reward system, and I wouldn't even say that's just the surface level. I would say that could just be gamification done wrong in many cases, because if you just cater to that and you only go for the extrinsic motivation, which is fine for many things, and maybe even sometimes getting started with something needs some extrinsic motivation to push you into getting started. But if you only cater to that, it's going to be shorthanded and it's not going to last too much, and the students will see through that reward system, where they'll just get used to it, and it's not going to work if you just think about it that way. I think going into things like the class culture that you're mentioning, some other things of intrinsic motivation, like things like creativity, like those kinds of things as well, are things that will certainly help you keep up the motivation and the engagement of your students. And it's way beyond just behavior control, as you were saying. So I completely agree with you, Dustin. The next thing that I would like to know, Dustin, and I know this is a difficult one because you have a similar question in your podcast, but it has many options. But if you had to say one, which would be your favorite game? And again, this can be board game, video game, card game, whatever you want to take it around.
So this is definitely a difficult question. I think I play a lot of board games recently, but I would say my all-time favorite. I'm gonna go with two because they're both PlayStation games. But Final Fantasy VII was RPG that I spent. I mean, it takes like 60 hours to beat. Played it maybe two or three different times, and then another one was SOCOM, which was one of the first games that was PlayStation Online, and I would haul over a tube TV to my cousin's place and my PlayStation, and we had set up our both of our PlayStations into the router when those were just becoming popular too, and we would play together on SOCOM, which is like a third person shooter.
Nice, nice. So two examples from video games, and that's definitely something that caters to a lot of the people. That was my start into games for sure, like at least formal games, not just the ones that you play in the with other kids and so on, but some formal sort of structure. I started with video games with back in the day with the Nintendo NES.
All right, yeah, yeah.
So I can definitely relate to that. Dustin, after hearing some of these questions, I know you've heard some of the episodes as well. Is there somebody that comes to mind that you would like to listen to in an episode like this one in Professor Game?
I would say one book I've read kind of recently, and it's been out for a while, is Theory of Fun by Ralph Koster. He does something really cool, I think, in the book where he is able to relate game mechanics to everyday life, and he talks about the different concepts of game design, applies them to how they help us learn and how they help us become a better society. And there's one thing that I think it's my favorite quote or favorite idea that comes from game based or game research is he talks about this term called grokking. And I didn't know about this term until I read it, but apparently it's from a science fiction novel, and then it took on a new meaning in the coding field, and it essentially means to intuitively and fully understand something. And he uses this term to kind of apply it to games and a level of mastery that games can provide that other art forms cannot necessarily provide, because with games we receive that feedback when we're doing something. And I think for language learning, especially language learning for games is something that grokking or mastery can really help, because in a game you're redoing those same grammatic structures, those same vocabulary words. You have to do it over and over and again, and you receive feedback from the other players in the game as well.
So you would recommend Ralph Koster as a guest and his book as well, I guess.
Yeah, maybe a guest too. Yeah.
You were mentioning the whole games and language learning, and something that always pops to my mind when I'm thinking about learning languages is at least 2 or 3 of my friends back home in Venezuela. They learned to speak English using only video games. Like literally, they didn't have English classes. They didn't go to any sort of English classes, and the English that they knew, and at least 2 of them had a pretty decent level of English. Like we used to have Model United Nations that we went to, and their level of English was pretty decent, and they only learned using video games. I mean, maybe later in their life they had some reinforcement, but all the basics that they had from their language as far as English was from video games. So I think that's a fantastic thing.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think just today I was interviewing prospective students for our university, and a couple of them had mentioned that they played computer games, and their English was pretty high level of English. And I kind of wanted to pick their brain and ask them how much of their English did they learn through computer games. Fortunately, we only have 5 minutes, so I couldn't get into those questions. But I really think I had a pretty high hunch that they probably learned a lot of English through playing computer games as well.
Actually, one of my friends was, or maybe he still is, working in Facebook in London. So I'm guessing that his English took him pretty far.
Oh, yeah.
So, Dustin, what would you say is your superpower, your sweet spot when doing board gaming in education or gamification? What would you say is your, that superpower?
I would say teaching. I think that's something I kind of discovered very early on when I started working in a restaurant. So that was my first job when I was 14. I worked at a taco restaurant. So in that job, in that position, I didn't train, but I did help new employees understand different things they needed to do. And then I moved on to work in a different restaurant, a Mexican restaurant, in college, and I quickly became a trainer. And I realized I'm very good at breaking down things into small steps so they can understand, and giving them examples and helping them realize or connect different ideas to help remember what they need to do. And I think that also helps with teaching how to play board games as well. So I seem to always be the one teaching how to play a new game.
So teaching, gamification, game-based learning, and teaching in general, I guess, would be your definite superpower. And I think that's a superpower that we need more of, not less of in general. So Dustin, we're arriving almost to the end of the interview, but of course there is this gamified question that we do make when we have time, and we definitely have time today. And the question that has come up while you were talking is this one from a listener. So this listener is asking, is there any actual proof that gamification is better than what we've always done with education? And I think it caters very well to what you're doing and to what your passions are. So what do you think, Dustin?
I would say as far as research goes, I would say there's likely some out there. I can definitely speak from my experience using gamification this past quarter and talking to my wife now this quarter, how much stronger their student-teacher relationship has been impacted from this gamification system last quarter. And even if that's all that is the benefit from it, maybe everything else is just the same level. The grades are the same, their behavior is the same, but that student-teacher relationship has further developed. I think just that is worth using gamification in the classroom, because I think that in and of itself increases engagement for students learning.
Yeah, and they appreciate it, because there's one thing that I do at my work at the university, and it's to show some of the learning materials that we have, the interactive learning materials that are available at the school. And one of the things is precisely that expectation that students have nowadays, that whole interactivity. I mean, because we've been more and more growing up in an interactive world that's like constantly giving us feedback in video games and board games and in many other situations. And then facing school and university and education in general being something that is super static and that has a very slow feedback system is a shock in the worst of senses for many students, and it doesn't necessarily benefit them in any way. So even if it's, as you say, just improving that relationship and their perception of what their education is and how good it can be for them and how useful it can be for their future, I think definitely, even if just for that, and it's not only that, there's been many results, and I'm sure you can mention some of those results. And you're probably after, because I heard one of the episodes of your podcast where you were helping your wife with this gamification system, you'll probably have some results at the end of the term and say, well, how can we compare this group of students to a previous group of students and how well they did and what were the results? But even beyond some like particular ones, as you were saying, I completely agree that even if just improving the relationship with their teachers, with their professors, with their education in general, I think it's completely worth it, as you were saying.
Right, definitely.
So Dustin, we are now finally arriving to the end of the interview, but I don't want to let you go before you give us any final piece of advice you want to leave the engagers with. Of course, please let us know where we can find you, where we can know more about your podcast, Board Gaming with Education, and anything else, any other place you want us to reach out to you.
I think my final advice would be to definitely, if you've never tried it, to get your feet wet and try it out, and through that, reach out to different communities. Our online social media is such a huge help recently. And I guess going into where you can find me, I do the podcast Board Game with Education, but with that, we're starting to build a community on Facebook as well. And we have different members in our community asking questions and answering questions about either game-based learning or gamification in schools or different learning settings. So you can find me through Facebook with Board Game with Education. If you're interested in the gamification kit that we'll hopefully have available this summer, you can go to our website, boardgamingwitheducation.com, and sign up for our email list. And if you want to contact me directly, you can find me at podcast@boardgamingwitheducation.com.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for all those references, for that great advice. And as we said before, the only way to understand and to get through with gamification is to actually try. maybe even fail a little bit and move on to your next challenge. So thank you very much, Dustin. I know it was a pleasure to have you here today with the Engagers. I hope you also enjoyed the interview as much as we did. However, now it's time to say that it's game over.
Hey Engagers, thank you for listening to Professor Game Podcast. And if you want more interviews with incredible guests like Dustin, then go to professorgame.com/subscribe and get started in our email list. That way, we'll be in contact and you will be the first to know of any opportunities that Professor Game might have for you. And before, of course, you go to your next mission. Would you like to know about open source and open resources for gamification? Then subscribe using your favorite podcast app and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.